Welcome to the webinar. I'll be sharing the screen in just a moment. And as I said, there will be plenty of time for Q&A. So this will be about 20 minutes of me presenting and answering questions that people have previously been asking, tricky questions about sharing and getting credit and not getting scooped on Protocols.io. We'll go over that in just a second. But we'll leave time for questions at the end. During the presentation, feel free to click on the Q&A and ask questions as we go along. And then Anita from Protocols.io will make sure that I get to the questions, or you'll be able to unmute yourself or type the questions at the end. So all of that works. And as Anita said, please note that the webinar is being recorded. So don't curse at me unless you're signed in anonymously during the presentation. And with that, let me share the screen and we'll get started. All right, so you should be able to see my slides now. So this is the copyright, credit, and scooping, the tricky details of protocol sharing. And as I mentioned, we will spend the next 15-20 minutes not really going over functionality on Protocols.io or features, but this is sort of the advanced webinar for those that are already using Protocols.io and know mostly what it's about and why. So we won't be going over the functionality, but we'll be going over questions that routinely pop up from people that are using it, that want to share, and are wondering how to share appropriately, how to give others credit, what they are allowed and not allowed to do, copyright, and things like that. Right? So the first question we'll start with, and that's one of the simpler ones, is can you share a protocol that was previously published in a journal? What about sharing a modified protocol from a private company, a reagent vendor? What do you do about sharing precisely what someone else has reported? So is it plagiarism to copy, paste identical words of a protocol? And if you enter the protocol, but you're not the one who developed it, how do you not steal credit from other people? And the next question will be, how do you balance the speed with which you're sharing, how early you let someone know about the technique and make it public, versus really being sure that it works and that it's robust. And then finally, we'll talk about the fear that journals will be upset when you're submitting a paper if you've already shared a protocol publicly before that. So these are some of the questions that, as I said, we often get, and we'll go over that and then leave more time for questions at the end. And before we get started, many of you, if you've seen me or someone from Protocols.io present, you might have seen one of our favorite tweets at the company on the topic of sharing methods and why it's important. So this is from a postdoc, Morgan Helene at UC Riverside, University of California, Riverside. And he said, looking for a protocol in 97 paper as described in 96, finds 96 paper as described in 87, finds 87 paper, paywalled. And that's a common and frustrating experience from a biologist. Here is a similar tweet from a physicist reading papers. Devices were fabricated as previously described, previously described, previously described, and the original reference is devices were fabricated using conventional methods. So the mission of Protocols.io, as many of you know, is to change that culture and to make it easy to share the method details and to collaborate and get credit for them and to share them before, during, and after publication. And in this webinar, we'll be focusing on that during publication and before. When can you share? What's okay to share? How to get credit? All of the questions we just went over. And those tweets in mind that I just showed, this webinar is for people who are already interested in making sure that We're not publishing papers that are frustrating to the readers, as we saw in the tweets above. So this is for people that want to share and are wondering what is okay, what isn't, and when we can do that. So with that, let's get started with some of the first questions. So sharing something previously published. And here is an email, anonymized email from a postdoctoral scholar at University of British Columbia, UBC. And this email actually touches on a number of the things that we'll be going through. So the email was sent, I think, about a year and a half ago. And it said, I have a quick question, and here we are with a whole webinar devoted to answering this email. I didn't wait a year and a half to answer it, don't worry. We wrote back to the person. But the email is about sharing publicly, and it's a protocol accompanying a paper that is a composite of several other protocols that have been published in 2 different journals. And some sections are word for word, so that's that plagiarism question that came up. They don't exist currently on protocols.io, so the person cannot fork them, and is asking for suggestions on properly sharing it. And also asks, would this be considered some form of copyright infringement? Right? So the legal question, and I'm not a legal scholar, but we have looked into it, and the legal question on copyright for sharing previously published protocols actually, I think, is one of the easier questions that we'll be tackling in this webinar. So it turns out that protocols, methods, recipes are actually not copyrightable. So there is a lot of precedent with cookbooks and cooking recipes. You can copyright a cookbook, but you can't really copyright a recipe. And from the Copyright Office of the US government, many years ago, they made this available online. And it specifically talks about ideas, methods, and systems, and says copyright law expressly excludes copyright protection for any idea, procedure, process, system, method of operation. And these slides are available, so I won't read the whole text in the interest of time. You'll be able to get to the slides and see it, and the link is at the bottom. But the point is, you can't actually copyright steps of a procedure. So that shouldn't be a worry. And on our FAQ, we talk about the fact that we actually have an answer to this explicitly on our help section in the FAQ. And I want to point out that out of 7,000 at this point, public protocols on protocols.io since our launch in 2014, we've never had an instance of someone contacting us saying, oh, I'd like to claim copyright. Someone shared a protocol that I've previously published, and I don't want anyone else to be allowed. I have it in my science paper, and I don't want anyone else to have it appear anywhere else. Never saw an instance of that on protocols.io or elsewhere. And one word of caution, though, is that when it comes to the rest of the manuscript, you do want to be careful unless the paper you're looking at is open access with a CC BY license. Figures from other papers that are not yours, images, those you want to be careful with. You don't want to just copy paste into your protocol or just take random things from the internet to make it prettier. You do want to check what are the licenses on the images and photos that you put in if they're not yours. And even if it's CC BY, make sure that you're giving credit to it and citing it appropriately. But for the steps themselves, I don't think copyright really is something to worry about. And a similar thing is actually something we're happy to report about protocols from vendors. So we have many, many instances of scientists sharing vendor protocols. So here are examples from a big vendor called QIAGEN. We don't have a formal relationship with the company, but there are a lot of scientists who use QIAGEN kits, and then they share protocols with QIAGEN in the title, and they're saying this is a modified QIAGEN prep. We've, again, since 2014, people have been doing this. Here's a modified Kyogen protocol from 2015. We've never had an instance of a reagent vendor coming to us saying, our protocol, please take it down from your website, tell that researcher not to share it. Has never happened. And the opposite actually has been happening a lot, where reagent vendors actively cross-post their protocols to protocols.io. They want you, they know that this is open access. They know that these are templates and you can click fork, as you can see in here. People are forking, discussing, making copies of these protocols. They want that to happen. They're not in the business of selling protocols. They're in the business of selling chemicals and reagents. So they're only happy to see that this happens. And we have a lot of companies that are explicit partners of protocols.io. But again, even those that we don't have a formal relationship with, we've never seen an instance of them being upset that scientists are optimizing and improving their techniques and sharing those modifications. And now we leave the copyright area and we go into the more tricky zone, which is the ethics, right? Am I plagiarizing? So going back to the email from the postdoc at UBC, they had asked some sections of the protocol, maybe word for word from these journal articles, supplemental materials, but they don't exist in protocols.io. So how do I go about this, right? Do I just cite it? And this is a question that we see popping up all the time on Twitter over the years. I don't know how many instances I've seen of exactly that. Here's just one example where the author says, I hate writing method sections for work that is the same as previous work. Tweaking wording that works to avoid self-plagiarism is tedious. This comes up for your own and especially for other people's methods, right? We're all taught not to plagiarize. So what's the ethical, what are the best practices for doing this for your own or other people's methods? And for guidance on this, we actually look to the Committee on Publication Ethics, COPE. And here's the past president of it, Jeannie Barbour. And she had replied to that tweet saying, actually, there's no reason to do that. If it's the same method, use the same words and reference it. It's been discussed at the Committee for Publication Ethics a lot, and there's a link to it. So in my slides, you'll see the link to that discussion and to the recommendation from COPE itself. And they explicitly say use of similar or identical phrases in method sections where there are limited ways to describe a method is not unusual. In fact, text recycling may be unavoidable when using a technique that the author has described before, and it may actually be of value. So the recommendation is if you've used something and it's been reported before, it's best not to randomly change words because you think that that's the more ethical thing to do. You're introducing errors when you do that. It's actually better to copy paste and report exactly what you've done. And when you can cite it, if it's been previously published or appears somewhere else, just add a link and the proper citation to that. And an increasing level of complexity and moral considerations, this is a tricky one. What if I'm sharing a protocol that is actually not one that I developed, that I've been working on for the last 3 years? And that is a complicated one, right? So on the one hand, you want to avoid these scenarios where you're just saying, oh, we did what the other group did. On the other hand, is it okay for me to take protocol from another group and put it on protocols.io if I'm not the one who developed it? They haven't done it. They only described it in a paper. So I want to make my manuscript more rigorous and more reproducible. I want to share the exact details, but I'm just using somebody else's protocol. So what is the ethical thing to do? And what I want to point out about protocols.io in this case is that we've thought a lot about this issue. And this isn't just for published papers. This is something that happens within your own lab. You're joining as a new student. There's a postdoc in this lab who has been developing the technique or the computational pipelines for the last 4 years and has now moved on. How do you give credit in these instances? So what we've done is we've separated the author lists from the contact on the protocol. The person who puts in and owns the recipe, owns the protocol, is the contact. And there is a separate author field under the title where one or more authors or whole consortium can be listed to make sure that you're crediting the people that actually did develop the technique, if you know who did develop it, right? So the contact is one field. The contact can change. If you leave or you no longer want to answer questions about it, you can reassign the protocol. The author field is fixed. That doesn't change. And when people ask questions on particular steps, which is one of the key features of protocols IO, or they ask questions on a protocol, those questions go to the contact. So every protocol does have a contact, does have someone that the questions will be emailed to, in addition to everyone who's using the protocol. But the author field is a separate text field to give credit to the people when it's not necessarily you. Right? So these things can be decoupled. And as I said, you can always reassign. You can always reassign a protocol to somebody else if you're leaving the lab. That can change. There is a history. We track who was the original contact, who's the new one. So that can change, but the author field is permanent. Once it's published, that stays. And in terms of evolution of protocols that I touched on for just a split second before, in terms of the evolution of protocols within a lab, this really is how science works, right? Rarely do we pull out a new method out of the air with no precedent, not based on anything else that has been done in the group we're in or by other scientists over the last 20 years or more. So sometimes if you don't know exactly who are the authors and it's just a protocol floating around in the lab that has been developed by the lab, consider just giving credit to the lab. So frequently we see people, instead of listing individual lab members, just say this is the Hurwitz lab, this is the Rhine lab in the author field. So you still have the contact, but you just mention the group, or you say anonymous, or you say not sure, right? And the other thing we want to point out in this webinar is that we also really do want to give credit and thank the people that are taking the time to actually put the protocols in, right? So just because you haven't developed it doesn't mean you don't deserve credit for taking the time, sitting down, and if it's a complicated 200-step protocol, maybe spending several hours putting it in and making it usable by others, making sure that it's clear. What if you record a video for how to do it? You didn't develop a protocol, but you just spent several hours recording a video so other people can reproduce this technique and follow this procedure exactly. You should get credit for it. So we think that it's totally okay as long as you do your best to give credit to the people that you know have worked on it before. And if you don't know who it is, just say so and make that clear. And we are going to be stopping in just a few minutes, but I did want to touch on the timing, not just the credit, but the timing of when we are sharing a protocol. And so there is this push and pull between wanting to rapidly communicate science. This comes with preprints, this comes with just in general science communication. I'm excited to share developments, progress, my discoveries, but am I sure about them, right? Do you spend an extra 10 years to make something perfect? What's good enough? When do you submit a paper? When do you share a protocol? These are things we constantly struggle with and try to find a balance. We're not going to be prescriptive about it, but we have some tips around it. So you have a technique, it's working for you, but have other people tried it? Has anyone in another lab tried it? Have your lab mates tried it? Or is it only you who can do it? And if it's only you, is it okay to share it? Not a simple question, but here's what we do at Protocols.io. Once you click publish, we ask you to certify what is the status of this protocol. Is it working? Is it in development? Or is it something else, right? So this is not other people rating your protocol. This is you self-certifying what you feel. Is it robust? How often have you used it? Is it working? Do you think other people can do it? Or is it a negative result? You've tried to get something to work but didn't, or it's still very early on and you're just excited to share it. And it's more like tweeting about promising results without being 100% sure that they will replicate. Okay? So you can check the box and then add your own details on what it means, what you've selected. If it's other, you can add a few sentences in here, or for any of these labels. You can be very clear with what you mean and what's the status of this protocol. And here's an example of a popular protocol with 70,000 views from the Fred Hutch Cancer Research Institute, the Henikoff lab. And it's certified as working. And if you mouse over it, there's a pop-up that says, we use this protocol in our group and it is working. Other people can click on it, and then you'll see a list of other names who say that it works for them. But in the very beginning, what will appear here is the self-certification from the researchers. And here's a different example where the authors clicked other, and if you mouse over this, the disclaimer is, we attempted to genetically transform S. robusta, but did not succeed. And this collection provides protocols that we use to arrive at the transformations. Everything should work, right? But they haven't gotten it to work, and they're sharing it, and that can be useful to other people as long as we're clear. Is it robust? Is it a negative result? So just use that field. And because there is versioning on Protocols.io, methods evolve. They're living, breathing organisms. So in the beginning, it may be in development, and then the next version that you share publicly is one that is working, and then you can share a new one with corrections and optimizations. And maybe you say in that one, it's now been reproduced in 30 different labs, right? So this is a label that should be developing and becoming more and more solid over time. And before I stop, and I see that there are already a few questions that have been added to the chat, which is wonderful, to the Q&A section. So I'm looking forward to answering. I think there are at least 3 already. Hopefully there will be more. But before I answer those questions, the last thing I wanted to touch on is, when do I share? Am I going to get in trouble with the journal when I submit my paper if I've already shared a protocol? And again, we address that in the FAQ. When you share in Protocols.io, we don't do peer review. It is not a peer-reviewed publication. So it's like sharing on arXiv or bioRxiv. It is not considered a prior publication. We have never seen a case of a journal publisher objecting to protocols being shared before the publication. In fact, the vast majority that we know of are totally fine with you not just sharing a protocol, but sharing the entire paper as a preprint, because they don't consider that previous formal publication. Moreover, with Protocols.io specifically, there are over 500 journals, and these are some of the publishers that explicitly recommend using Protocols.io when you're submitting a paper to them. So it's not just reagent vendor companies, but we have good relationships with many publishers. And here's an example from the author submission guidelines from PLOS Genetics, where they recommend and encourage depositing lab protocols in Protocols.io. They give the step-by-step instructions for doing that. And to emphasize, they explicitly say you can make your protocols public at any time by selecting publish, or if you haven't done that, when the paper goes live, they will become public automatically. So you have different ways you can share when you're submitting a paper in an unlisted fashion. You can just click Get DOI. I'll show that in a second. And also, just journals aside, I do want to emphasize we're not everything starts out privately. Most of the protocols on Protocols.io are private, and you decide when to share. You can share just as in Google Docs with individuals by email or with a group. You can give them permission, so you can decide how to share. There is a private shareable link. When you click on the share button, you can get a private link that you can share with people who are not registered on Protocols.io. It's view only, but that's an easy way to give a link to someone so that they can give you feedback on their work or can use it even before you're ready to publish it and get a DOI. And the last thing I wanted to say is that instead of publish, when you're submitting to a journal, as you saw in the guidelines for PLOS, and most of the journal partners that we have list that specifically in their guidelines, you also have this Get DOI button that, as you're preparing a manuscript, gives you, registers a DOI with Crossref, but it's an unlisted protocol, so only you have the link, the editors and reviewers have that DOI, but until you formally click publish, this is not indexed by Google. This doesn't appear in search results. It doesn't appear under your profile on Protocols.io. So it's sort of like an unlisted YouTube link, but it is, you are making it then permanently available, as you can see in this disclaimer. So the only way to then edit it after that is to create a new version with a click of a button and get a new DOI. And with that, I'll stop. Here is the link to the slides. We will also make the video available. As we said, we are recording it. And now I'll get to the questions. But let me also, I'll stop sharing. Let me also, into the chat, put in the link to the slides. And as Anita said, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A section. So let's see if there are some already. One has been answered, and that was a question on, can you send a link to a beginner's webinar on functionality? Oh, really good point. I was actually going to start with that. Thank you, Keith, for asking this, and Anita for replying in the Q&A. This was a sort of advanced webinar for those who know Protocols.io, but we have really good help section, and we have webinars for getting started with Protocols.io. There is a tutorials section, so if you look at the Q&A in the answered column, you'll see the links to the basic tutorials and webinars on Protocols.io. Thank you, Anita, for answering that. And then there is a question that came in from one of the attendees. What if I publish a method that I didn't develop, but then the original authors want me to take it down? Is that possible? We do this on case-by-case basis. We occasionally, 1 or 2 times a year, get into a situation where someone has shared, despite all of the disclaimers and opting in the publishing flow, where we ask you, did you talk to your co-authors? Did you talk to your supervisor? There are occasional instances where someone shares something prematurely or there's some conflict. We do have the ability to enlist. It's case-by-case basis, so you need to email info@protocols.io. We have editorial policies we review, and if you need it taken down and there's a good justification, if there's a patent dispute or something like that, or author dispute, we can take it down. Or as journals can do, we can put a retracted notice on it. So take it down means we can make it unlisted. That's one simple thing. And then you just share a new version, or you share as appropriate, when appropriate, publicly. But if you really are concerned about people finding it, if a link has been shared in the paper and you don't think that it's appropriate anymore, you can get in touch with us. We'll review the case, and we do have a retraction mechanism where we'll put a retracted notice. But the DOI does have to result, otherwise we'll be in trouble with Crossref, the nonprofit organization that issues the DOIs. Next question is it possible to publish without issuing an official DOI? You can do the sharing. You can share private link without the DOI. At the moment, we don't have publishing without DOI, but that is in development right now and should be going live sometime in the next 2-3 months. So that will be an option soon, but it's not yet. Next question. In a similar case, if I'm publishing a paper which uses a lab technique, is it okay to link the protocol to the paper and vice versa? Would it be better for reproducibility, but wouldn't that encourage people to cite my paper while I did not develop the method? Really good question. We do, if your protocol accompanies a paper, it is best practice. This is why we partner with the publishers and journals. It is best practice to link to the paper. In fact, if you click on the metadata field of any protocol that accompanies a paper, we explicitly ask people to cite both the protocol and the paper. But you should just make it clear in the protocol. If it's a protocol developed by somebody else, you should be citing it in the paper. And in the protocol, you can make it clear in the guidelines. You can just say, if you're using this technique, we didn't develop it, we've just modified it, or we're using it precisely as reported in this other book, in this other article. So just guide people to that original reference if you know what it is. But particularly if you made any tweaks or modifications, give them credit, tell people to cite it. But if somebody is reproducing your work and reading your paper and following the link to the protocol, you do want to make sure that they're using your protocol and that they're pointing people to it later on, not just to the original publication, because then if we don't do that, we're back in what we started with the tweets from the biologist and physicist, where we really don't know what was done and what are the modifications. So we can give credit. It is a juggling act, but we can give credit and report precisely what we've done. Next question. So protocols also works as a kind of preprint repository. That is 100% correct. It's a private development tool first. When you create a protocol, it's yours and only you can see it. Once you share it, it's exactly like bioRxiv, but for protocols. In fact, if you try to submit a protocol to bioRxiv, they say that it's out of their scope and they will guide you to protocols.io to share the protocol itself. And then there's a question, what if I just modified a protocol of some authors? What if I just modified a protocol of some authors according to my availability of things, if it works? Yeah, this is really the heart of protocols.io. We tweak things based on the organisms we're using. You're working with grasshoppers, I'm working with crickets. We tweak them based on the equipment, right? Am I in a lab in UCSF, or am I in the field in western region of Tanzania doing sampling? What's available to me? What equipment am I using? And that will change the protocol. So give credit to the original, but please, please, please do report what you're using and what you've changed. Our goal, we're not a journal, we're not a book of the 5 protocols that work for Drosophila. We are a platform for sharing these tweaks, these versions, and we want the grasshopper and the slightly modified cricket protocol to be up so that people can see exactly what was done. And just as a reminder, so these are, I think we're running a little bit over time. As a reminder, you can always email us at info@protocols.io. On the slide at the end, I shared my personal email is just lenny@protocols.io. And unfortunately, instead of typing it to everyone, lenny@protocols.io, you can always email. I do want to let people go because we're at just 32 minutes since we started, 33. If you want to stay on, I'll be here answering questions. We'll also share the videos so you can get questions of others at the end. And again, there are some questions that have already been answered. So I want to thank everyone for attending. I will stick around and answer more questions, and I'll quickly review what was already asked in the and answered already in the Q&A section. But again, thank you so much for fantastic questions. Thank you for joining, and stay healthy. And let's see. So the first three I already answered. Publishing without DOI. If I'm publishing a paper which uses a lab technique, is it okay to link the protocol to the paper and vice versa? Oh, I think we already answered that. Is it like a kind of preprint repository? We answered that. What if I just modified a protocol of some author according to my availability? Oh, we already answered that too. So I think that's it. If anybody wants to unmute and has any other questions, please do so. And otherwise, thank you all for taking the time to tune in. And thank you, Anita, for helping to host it, recording it, organizing. And thank you, Nastya, for getting it up and going before the webinar itself. So Anita and Nastya are folks from Protocols.io that I'm very grateful to. Thank you all. Have a good rest of the week.